You know, one thing that has really impressed me during this COVID-19 pandemic is the speed and the degree of compliance with the strict guidelines that the medical experts and our government leaders have recommended. I mean, think about the radical changes that pretty much have been adopted worldwide in short order. Hand washing and sanitizing regularly, frequently, rigorously. Social distancing, people are just living in consciousness of keeping at least 6 feet between people who aren't in your household. Disinfecting touch surfaces. Wearing protective masks and staying at home. I mean, to obtain that degree of compliance worldwide is phenomenal, is impressive. We were in the dark. The rank and file of the public were in the dark about these microscopic invaders that we now see plastered on every news screen, that little rose-colored ball with suction cups sticking out. But we were absolutely in the dark about that reality. But the scientists, the medical experts, with their microscopes and other tools, brought the truth to our attention, and the whole world began living differently. They proclaimed and they demonstrated by the way they lived their lives the reality that we were blind to, and it had an effect on all of us. And I refer to this because I think it illustrates, at least partially, Jesus' message in his Sermon on the Mount, and in particular in the verses that we're looking at today. We finished the Beatitudes now, those 8 blessed are statements that Jesus makes. And so today we're turning to verses 13 through 16 of Matthew chapter 5. The words of Jesus, he said this: "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." Again, the scientists and the medical experts brought to light a reality the rest of us were in the dark about. And in so doing, they helped preserve many, many lives. Even so, Jesus tells his disciples, tells us who are his followers, you are the light for people who are living in spiritual darkness. You are the light to open their eyes to the truth, and you are the salt to preserve humanity from decaying and rotting in sin. I think the most helpful way I can approach these verses is just by using a handful of prompting questions. And so let's approach this passage through these questions. Number one, whom is Jesus calling the salt of the earth and the light of the world? And if you were to just look up a few verses in Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, you would see that Jesus, he's surrounded by a crowd. He's up on the mountain surrounded by a crowd, but he has drawn his followers. He's called his disciples in close. Those who have determined that we want to follow this guy. We're trusting this Jesus. And so he's actually teaching his disciples, his followers, but he's got masses of people looking and listening on from all around. But who are those that he's calling the salt of the earth and the light of the world? His followers, his disciples. Not everybody, but those who are trusting him, those who are following him. Second question. So how did these people become this salt and light that Jesus describes them as? And the answer is by trusting him, by trusting in him. When they became his followers, when they said, we want you to lead our lives, we want to follow in your footsteps, we believe in you, we trust in you, that is the point at which they became this salt and light. Why is this so? Because Jesus is the light. And when we receive him, we receive the light. When we receive Jesus, we receive sight. The light comes into our lives. And so Jesus said in John chapter 8, verse 12, I am the light of the world. The one who follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So through faith in the revelation of God, and that revelation of God, God has given us revelation in creation around us. God has given revelation to us through his spokespersons, the prophets, and much of that revelation he has preserved for us in the book that we call the Holy Scriptures, the Bible. That's the revelation of God. And the Bible tells us that supremely God has given us revelation through Jesus Christ. Through Jesus Christ himself. And so through faith, when a person says, I'm going to trust what God has revealed, I'm going to trust what God has made known about himself, about me, about humanity, about this universe. I'm going to trust everything that he has revealed. I'm going to believe that what he has revealed is true. At that point, faith in God's revelation, our eyes have now been opened. And we now see the truth. We now see reality. Before that, we were in the dark. Before that, we were groping our way in spiritual blindness through life, not seeing the truth, not seeing reality. But now, when we receive Jesus, we receive the light. Third question, why does Jesus describe us, his followers, as the light of the world? Why does he say, you, my disciples, back then and right now, you are the light of the world? Well, think of the function of light. Light shows things for what they really are. Light exposes reality. It shows reality. Light makes the truth visible and apparent. You know, all of us have probably experienced power outages in a storm, or maybe you've got too many appliances running some evening and you blow a circuit breaker. And now what are you doing? Well, you're groping your way through your house. I gotta stay here. You're groping your way through your house, trying to find the candles, and then where are the matches, or the flashlight, and then where are the batteries? But at least you've seen your house. And so you have imprinted in your memory this design, and so your hands, oh yeah, I recognize this, and you can make your way there. But imagine, some of you have taken cave tours. And in some of those tours, they will give you the experience of turning off the lights, and you're in the bowels of the earth. And you don't know your way through this cave, and there are dangers, there are pitfalls, there is water, and some of it's pretty deep, and there's stalactites and stalagmites, and crevices, and all sorts of dangers. Now imagine you wake up and find yourself someplace where it's absolutely dark. And you have not seen it before, there's no memory of it imprinted, but you're having to grope your way through. I mean, you can just instantly sense how dangerous and how difficult that would be. And that is basically the picture that the Bible describes fallen humanity as. That when we turned our backs on God as a race, when we turned our backs and said, we don't want things the way that you have given them to us, we don't want things to be the way you have described them, we want to create our own reality, we cut ourselves off from the truth. We became spiritually blind. And now we're groping our way through life in absolute blindness. We're denying. When we rejected the truth, we rejected reality as it is. We're now groping our way, and we're stumbling, and we're falling, and we're banging ourselves, and basically we're walking a path of self-destruction. But in knowing and believing Christ, in knowing and living according to the truth, we now become revealers of the light to others. Once we embrace Jesus, once we embrace the revelation of God, we receive the light. We see things for what they are. And at that point, we can live as those who see things. Imagine, you've never seen the auditorium configured like this. Imagine if you were in here in the dark, there were no lights, and you were trying to find your way around here. You'd be banging into chairs, you'd be stumbling and falling, and probably come out with some injuries. But now that you have received the light of Jesus and you are living in accordance with what is true and real, you become a living light to others around us. You are living in terms of and in cooperation with reality and the truth. And so you become, and I become, light to those who are still spiritually blind. When we believe God's word, when we believe his truth, his revelation, we have come to see and know things as they really are, and our lives begin to demonstrate that. We will live differently. That's why Psalm 119, 105 says, your word is a lamp to my feet, and it's a light to my path. It shows me how to walk, how to live. The medical professionals that began appearing on our TV screens, and they had masks on, the news media reporters that had masks on, and we saw them with their hand sanitizer. That became an example. These people know the truth. They know the truth about this invisible, unseen microbe that is deadly. And they're living according to that reality. They're putting on masks. They're staying apart from each other. Oh, look at that. They're videotaping from home. They're not going to the TV studio anymore. And so we began seeing these people living out the truth that they knew. And not only their speech became light to us, telling us this is the way things are. And you may not see it, you may be blind to it, but this is the way things are. But their example of living in light of what they knew to be true also became light to us. And we began following that light and living according to that light. When the driver in front of you all of a sudden swerves, what do? You didn't see the reality of that big pothole. You didn't see the reality of that road hazard. But when you saw somebody else living in conformity with that truth, it alerted you, and it basically turned the light on for you through their example to be able to be walking and living in the light. We as Jesus followers, tremendous service that we provide the world as we live in the light of what we know to be true, but they're blind to. We, in effect, help turn the light on for them. Question 4, why does Jesus describe us, his followers, as the salt of the earth? Well, salt is an antiseptic that protects flesh, whether that's food like meats or wounds that we may get, protects flesh from decaying and rotting, and thus salt is a preservative. Now we have refrigerators and freezers, but when they, in Jesus' day and through much of human history, wanted meat to last longer than the immediate, they would rub salt into it because that would preserve the meat and keep it from rotting and decaying. Further, those of you who are bakers, how many of you are bakers here? All right. Those of you who are bakers know that salt has a retarding effect on the activity of yeast. It retards the activity of leaven. Now, Passover, according to the instructions of the Bible, falls during the week, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And you may remember that one of the provisions for the Feast of Unleavened Bread was that each household would make a thorough search of their entire dwelling place, and they would find all yeast, all leaven, and they would remove it from their home. They did not want to have leaven in their home. And in that situation, yeast or leaven was a symbol for sin. It's not always in the Bible used as a symbol or a signifying of sin, but in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, yeast was representative of sin, because sin is so easily spread. It's so contagious. It just pervades society, and when one of us indulges and gives ourselves permission, it affects and influences other people. And so the Bible takes a zero-tolerance stand, and it says, if you tolerate any of it, it's going to spread. It's going to take over your household. If you give yourself permission, it'll take over your life. It'll take over your household. It'll take over your relationships, because we as human beings are in community. We live in line with one another. And so the description of getting rid of yeast or leaven is a picture of get rid of sin in your life. And here Jesus says you're the salt of the world. And one of the effects of salt is that it retards the expansion and the activity of yeast. So putting all this together, salt as an antiseptic, a preservative, as a retardant for leaven, we kind of get this picture that humanity, again, in rejecting God and rejecting the revelation of God, has cut itself off from its moral anchor. And the philosophers, some of you have dabbled in philosophy, read a little bit, and maybe in apologetics, but when you reject God, when you reject transcendent morality and transcendent truth and standards, everything is relative now. And so when you turn your back on God, and you don't have to be an atheist to do this, you can just practically live as if there's no God. You can just practically live as if He hasn't spoken and as if He hasn't revealed any truths or principles to us. But there is nothing to stop you from doing anything you feel like doing. There's no moral compass. There is no moral anchor at all. And so what have we seen in the history of humanity? Very early on in the page, as the Bible describes the course of human history, very early on we see humanity descending to an absolute nadir of perversity and murder and every sexual perversion there is. Humanity has sunk so quickly into... How long did it take for the first murder? Next page. They ate the fruit, turn the page, next, the first murder. Cain and Abel. But very, very quickly, humanity, when they rejected God, deteriorated into murder and shedding innocent blood and human sacrifices, child sacrifices, horrible child sacrifices, every imaginable perversion, sexual and otherwise. And humanity has just relentlessly pursued a course of self-destructive behavior. We will vigorously defend the right to destroy ourselves. And we have over and over again. I read an article this week, some recent archaeological discoveries down in Mexico, Mesoamerica, about the horrible human sacrifices of the Aztecs and other Mesoamerican peoples. And archaeologists are finding evidence that literally hundreds of thousands of human sacrifices were offered in the most violent way on an annual basis 200,000 in a single year. That's what happens when you cut yourself off from any moral anchor, any moral compass. And we can look back on that and we can think, oh, those primitive people. But listen, that kind of behavior has been a part of every generation right up until the present. We've got the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust in World War II, one of the most civilized, advanced nations behaving in the same way as the Mesoamericans, as the ancient Near Easterns that offered child sacrifices. And then you keep moving forward and you've got genocide throughout the 20th century. Rwanda, Turkey, Armenia, any number of places. In Southeast Asia now, genocide going on. And then what do we call our culture of abortion? Here in the United States, the abortion holocaust. That's because society has cut off the only thing that would hinder them from total self-destruction in the most terrible ways. And Jesus basically says here, when he calls us light, that his followers, the people who receive and trust the Word of God, who follow Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life, serve to have a preserving effect on humanity, on human society. You and I and the followers of Jesus in every generation have kept this world from self-destruction, and we're doing it right now. Never underestimate the influence that Jesus is having on every single child of God, every single follower of him. The power of God is invested in each one of us, and we may compare ourselves to the Billy Grahams or the prominent Christians, but the power of God is preserving human society and keeping this world from destroying itself through every follower of Jesus. You know, one last thing about salt is that salt enhances the flavor of everything else. Have you ever looked at the ingredients on candy bars or your favorite sweets? Amazing how far up the list salt appears. You know, they list the ingredients in the order of percentage. And it's amazing how much salt is in the sweetest things. And if you stop and pause as you're biting that favorite candy bar of yours, oh yeah, I can taste salt there. Matter of fact, the culinary experts say that the genius in cooking is the proper balance between sweet and salty. That is what will make something very, very popular and a bestseller versus something that people just yawn at. But the salt effect of Jesus' followers on society enhances sweetness and suppresses bitterness. Scientific research shows this. Salt enhances sweetness and suppresses bitterness. And that's what followers of Jesus do in the world. We enhance sweetness and we suppress bitterness out there. Now consider this, folks. Let's turn again to this season that we're in, the coronavirus pandemic. Have you been pleasantly surprised at the general degree of compassion that has been exhibited in society and in the world, and expressions of, hey, we're in this together, and kindness of strangers who probably wouldn't call themselves followers of Jesus, but in general there has been a tenor, a feeling of compassion and kindness, I think, displayed. Maybe not so much in some places of the world, but it has really caught my attention. Why is that? Where does that come from in a society that can be guilty of can defend and champion abortion and every self-destructive behavior, and all of a sudden turning around and expressing compassion toward neighbors? That is the salt. That is the salt of Jesus. Jesus is in this world. How? He is in this world through his people. And Jesus had a dramatic effect in his day. We read the Gospels and we see the effect Jesus had then. Jesus is continuing to affect this world, but now his presence is through his people. through his followers. You know, Rick Warren, some of you remember when he wrote the bestseller, Purpose-Driven Life, about 20 years ago, and that just over 1 million copies of that book and all sorts of tools for small groups, and that was a great evangelistic tool. People that weren't part of the church were coming in because they said, my life just feels like it's floundering, like it's purposeless. And so they would come in and be part of these small groups, and I need purpose in my life. Well, Rick Warren was used of the Lord to have a huge impact in society, and in particular, the way that he taught in the purpose-driven life. It's not about you. It's about God. It's about others. And the way he lived, he gave away the royalties of his books. He returned to his church. He's a pastor of a megachurch in the Los Angeles area. He returned the salaries for the previous years that he had received. He and his wife started reverse tithing, giving 90% and only keeping 10% for themselves. But his impact started having an impact on other very prominent and wealthy people. Bill and Melinda Gates. Now, we know them now for being very active philanthropists and giving away millions and millions and millions of dollars to worthy causes. They have expressed how Rick Warren in the Purpose-Driven Life greatly impacted them. And there was a circle of friends in that same strata of society that were similarly impacted. They didn't become followers of Jesus, but the salt effect of Jesus through Rick Warren moved beyond even the followers of Jesus to impact people and slow down the decay and the deterioration and the rot that would be the natural development of people who turn their back on God. Number 5, why does Jesus talk about salt losing its saltiness and light being hidden? Well, first of all, he wants us to ask ourselves the question, do we truly have the salt and light in our lives? Because Jesus basically says, you don't have to salt it up there. Salt up. Give me a little bit more. Suzanne over here, turn the monitor up. Turn the sound up so I can hear. But you don't have to tell salt it up here. Give me a little bit more. Salt is salty. Its identity translates directly over into its effect and into its purpose. Light. Jesus says, if there's light, it shines. Who in the world turns the light on only to put a basket over it to cover it? And basically what Jesus is saying is, if I am in somebody's life, I'm light, Jesus says, and as such, I shine. And if somebody says, I've got Jesus in my life, Jesus says, if I'm in somebody's life, I'm going to be shining there. I'm not going to move into somebody's life only to cover myself up and hide. If I move into somebody's life, you had better believe I'm going to shine. And in the same way, salt. If salt is there, you're going to taste it. You're going to be able to sense the saltiness. And so the first reason that Jesus talks about salt losing its saltiness and light being hidden is because he wants us to ask ourselves, do we truly have them? Am I claiming it, but I really don't have the reality? Again, being salt and light is first about identity and then about purpose and function. Jesus, as you recall, began his Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. Blessed are. He's been talking about characteristics. Blessed are the poor in spirit. That's a characteristic. Now, if you have poor in spirit, that is going to exhibit itself in conduct. It's a state of mind that will be expressed in action. Blessed are those who mourn over sin. If you're bothered by sin, if it grieves you, if it saddens you, if it weighs your heart heavily down to see the sin in your life, and you're disgusted about it, that's a characteristic that is going to become evident in the way that you conduct yourself. And so on, all the way down through, the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who are persecuted. That's an action. But that's really not the characteristic that's being highlighted there. The characteristic is, blessed are those who rejoice when they're persecuted because of righteousness and for the sake of Jesus. Blessed are those who consider that to be an honor, is the characteristic. But the point is that the Beatitudes point to identity, point to characteristic, not to a list of to-dos that you get out there, grab yourself by the bootstraps and march yourself through. It's about identity. It's about a new heart that Jesus has placed within us. So again, Jesus says, each of you need to ask yourself, do I have the real deal? Do I have the salt and light? Another reason that Jesus talks about this is, what was the last of the Beatitudes? What did we finish on just before we came to these verses? Persecution. Now, persecution can be a temptation for us to clam up. If we start getting slapped around because we're shining like light, if we start getting beat up because we're living out the salt, we're bringing some. When you bring salt to a wound, how does that feel? What does it do for you? All right, so if we're salt, part of the effect we're going to have is salt touching the wounds of this world can be painful along the way. When we tell the truth, it's because you're destroying yourself because of sin in your life. You've turned your back on God. You need to repent. You need to confess your sin. Typically, how do people react to that kind of message? That's salt in a wound. And you start getting, backhanded because of your salt in a wound, and you may want to kind of suppress the salt. You may want to kind of limit the light that you're shining. We can't do that. We don't dare do that. One theologian, Helmut Thielicke, says this: to look at some Christians, one would think that their ambition is to be the honeypot of the world. They sweeten and sugar the bitterness of life with an all too easy conception of a loving God. But Jesus did not say you're the honey of the world. He said you're the salt of the earth. Salt bites. And the unadulterated message of the judgment and the grace of God has always been a biting thing. So Jesus is saying, listen, you've got to be willing to be that biting salt, or you'll be worthless. You'll be no good to anybody. You've got to be willing to represent the truth, even if it stings. Another reason that Jesus talks about this is because impurities can dilute salt. Impurities can dilute salt. John Stott does a great job of expressing this. He says, strictly speaking, salt can never lose its saltiness. I'm given to understand that sodium chloride, which is the chemical name for our common table salt, I'm given to understand that sodium chloride is a very stable chemical compound which is resistant to nearly every attack. Nevertheless, it can be contaminated by mixture with impurities, and then it becomes useless, even dangerous. What was back then popularly called salt was in fact a white powder, perhaps from the Dead Sea area, very salty, which while containing sodium chloride also contained much else, since in those days there were no refineries. Of this dust, the sodium chloride was probably the most soluble component, most easily dissolved by moisture, and so the most easily washed out. And so you'd have this white powder that maybe originally held a prominent concentration of salt, but rain, it gets collected and rain washes through it and begins to dissolve the salt out of it. And you still have this white powder, but all of a sudden there's no saltiness, there's no saline in it, just whatever those other substances were. Well, what's the application of this? So too a Christian. Christian saltiness is a Christian character as depicted in the Beatitudes, and committed Christian discipleship exemplified in both word and deed. For effectiveness, the Christian must retain his or her Christ-likeness. If Christians become contaminated by the impurities of the world, they lose their influence. The influence of Christians in and on society depends on their being distinct, not identical. distinct, not identical. And so when we begin becoming worldly, we lose our saltiness. And so Jesus says, examine yourselves. Does there need to be some purifying taking place? And number 6, the last of my questions, what is Jesus' application of this? What is the response Jesus wants from these words of his? He wants us to examine our lives. He's saying, where I am, I shine, again, because I'm the light, and if you have me in your life, you will shine with my light. Are you shining with my light? Are you living out the characteristics that I've described to you in the Beatitudes? Is that the kind of effect you're having on people around you? The Beatitude effect? Are you having the Jesus effect on people around you? He wants to encourage us in the Jesus difference. The Jesus difference that we are making in society as we live out the salt and light. And he wants to encourage us about the Jesus difference we can make in society if we boldly let our Jesus light and salt shine and salt for the glory of God. Let your light so shine before people that they will see your good works in a way that will glorify the Father in heaven. Viewing this from the reverse angle, what kind of influence are you having? Is your effect on people around you pointing back to poor in spirit, mourning over sin, being gentle because you're just submitted to the Lord? Is the effect that you're having on people around you the effect of someone who hungers and thirsts, not for the same things the world is hungering and thirsting after, but for righteousness? That's what I long. Is the effect you're having on people around you the effect of someone who is merciful, has purity of heart, is a peace retaliator? You retaliate to the wrongdoing and the offenses with peace instead of retaliating in kind. Rejoicing to be persecuted because of righteousness and because of Jesus. Husband, what effect and influence are you having on your wife? Are you having a Jesus effect on your wife? And vice versa. Wife, is that the effect that you're having on your husband? Parents, on your children. Employees, on your co-workers and supervisors. Citizens, on your neighbors. Parishioners, on your fellow congregants in the church. Are we having the effect of the light and the salt of Jesus? We are having an effect, make no mistake about it. What effect are we having? Brothers and sisters, I just urge us to take seriously the profound impact the Beatitudes, which is the salt and light of Jesus lived out, the Beatitudes have had throughout history, they continue to have in our day, and that they can have moving forward as we live them out in a world that is the opposite of them. A world in spiritual darkness, a world that has no moral compass or preserver to keep it from decaying. If we have the light, let us live as those who see, whose eyes are open, who see reality and the truth for what it is. Let us not suppress it. Let us shine the light. Let us be bold with the message and the example of Jesus. If we're the salt of the earth, let us be salty. Let us flavor everywhere we are and go with the saltiness of Jesus. If we are among the blessed ones in Jesus' Beatitudes, let us live them out loud and show people God's glory.